Should transgender girls who are biological males be allowed to use girls' bathrooms and play on girls' sports teams in K through 12? You have 15 seconds to clarify.
In cases across Virginia, I think it's incumbent upon parents and educators and administrators in each local community to make decisions.
Would you rescind the Youngkin administration policy requiring boys and girls to use bathrooms aligning with their biological sex?
In each local community, decisions should be made between parents and educators and teachers in each community.
Can you imagine that running a state in this country? What are we doing?
So we got more updates today on the upcoming Virginia and New Jersey governor's elections that we've been covering pretty extensively as of late. Because simply put, the Republican surge is continuing. And I want to remind everyone that both Virginia and Jersey are blue states that were won comfortably by Kamala Harris, which is to say that especially on an off year where Donald Trump is the incumbent president, and historically that is a factor that helps energy and turnout for the opposition party, this is something that should be relatively easy and straightforward for Democrats. All they're being asked to do is win an election in a blue state on an off year where they can actually scare their own voters about Trump being in the White House, and yet it is not coming so easily to Democrats. Why is that? It could be because Trump is more popular than they are able to admit, or perhaps the Democrats are less popular than they personally believe that they are, or perhaps the Charlie Kirk assassination is having something of a galvanization effect on the political right. Who exactly knows? But in today's video, we have yet more evidence as yet another poll is showing the Republican New Jersey governor's candidate, Jack Ciattarelli, currently tied with Mikie Sherill, who is the highly incompetent Kamala Harris 2.0 style Democrat who is currently imploding in the race as we speak, and recent governor's debate performances have not exactly gone in her favor, as well as a bunch of political scandals, and I guess you could say October surprises. Or checking in on the Virginia governor's race, where a similar picture is showing. Although the Democrat, Abigail Spanberger, enjoyed a comfortable lead in this race and was a obvious favorite for a long time, the polls are starting to narrow. Republicans are coming home to the ballot or starting to show up now in the data. And this could be partially linked to another atrocious debate performance by another Democrat governor candidate. It could also have to do with the fact that the now infamous Attorney General Jay Jones decided to give the Democrats that October surprise by fantasizing about murdering Republicans in his leaked text messages, which, by the way, now have completely inverted his own odds in that race, and the Republican Jason Miyares now a clear favorite, which is certainly at the very least good news. I mean, I still think it's highly concerning that, at least according to this poll, 43% of voters in Virginia still would support Jones and 8% are undecided. But hey, maybe it is something of a statement to the radical and insane left. Even in Virginia, you're not as popular as you believe you are. Nonetheless, we'll tell you about this here today. We'll actually compare some of this past to present data in New Jersey to show you why this race could be looking really, really interesting, as well as show you yet another example of Abigail Spanberger utterly imploding when she is asked a simple and real question. Are you noticing, by the way, something of a pattern with these Democrat governor candidates? You know, I'm just saying, but we'll tell you all about it. First, though, do us a favor. If you enjoy our content, make sure you hit that like button down below and subscribe to the channel if you are new. That is the best way to support our work and ensure that we can keep bringing you these videos. And that said, so earlier in this week, just to recap, we showed you polls like this out of Emerson and The Hill, conducted at the end of September, showing Ciattarelli, the Republican, tied with Mikie Sherill, the Democrat, in the state of New Jersey. But we just got a more recent one out of Neighborhood Research. Keep in mind, this is a Republican polling institute, so take it with a grain of salt. But again, the overall picture is showing what? If it's tied or close to tied, really close, within the margin of error, right? That is huge news out of New Jersey, needless to say. And as you can see, this now has Jack Ciattarelli tied at 44% with Mikie Sherill. But here is another interesting statistic that, by the way, multiple polls have been showing, not just this one, that among independent voters, Jack Ciattarelli is breaking, or I should say they are breaking hard for Jack Ciattarelli. He's currently enjoying a 19-point lead, 49-30 over Mikie Sherill, which is further interesting because a recent morning consult survey conducted in the state of New Jersey just earlier this month actually found really interesting trend that New Jersey is now a state where the plurality slightly of voters do identify as conservative. You can see 32% said they were conservative in Jersey, 30% said liberal, 30% said moderate. And by the way, you have to imagine, right, this liberal number used to be much higher decades ago, but largely because of the crazy radical turn of maybe the National Democrat Party, as well as I'd have to imagine a lot of aspects of failures of local leadership. A bunch of these former liberals have hopped over to that moderate camp. By the way, I grew up in Southern California. I know a lot of people actually who have gone through this same trend line. I'm sure maybe you do too, where they're not quite in the conservative category just yet, but former diehard Democrat voters who now are a little bit on the fence and would be open to it a little bit, right? Well, you're starting to see that trend. Look at how hard the independents are breaking for Ciattarelli. This could be huge, ladies and gentlemen. This poll also further found out that contrary to what we usually know in recent history about the Republican energy factor, which is to say that, you look at many of the special elections, the midterms, even in 2022, Republicans don't really like to show up to vote. They're kind of lazy, low propensity voters, generally speaking, right? I shouldn't say lazy, but just not caring that much, okay? We'll use that term. Well, you can see among high propensity voters, Jack Ciattarelli in this case actually leading Mikie Sherill by 4 points, 46-42, which is a really interesting trend line. Breaking down this poll even more, it seems to be explained by the fact, and by the way, in an off-year election, this is an advantage for us, that in Jersey, the voters over 50 are breaking pretty hard for Ciattarelli. It's mainly voters under 50, younger voters, that Sherill is winning. Now, that's a mixed bag with Gen Z nationwide, because I'd argue in the 2024 election, we did see actually a bunch of voters under 55 kind of carry Trump, and even the 65 plus, a lot of like older baby boomers actually basically broke 50-50 for Harris. Not here to get too much into the math, but anyways, just to break down the demography of at least the state of New Jersey, right? Over 50, more conservative. Under 50, less conservative. Well, needless to say, this is not a presidential election, right? So the highest turnout's going to be coming from older voters. That's why this is an inherent built-in advantage, and hence why among high propensity, right, you're seeing Ciattarelli actually lead by 4. So, usually in these types of videos, I'm trying to urge Republicans, hey, go out to vote, make sure you turn out. And I'm still going to do that. However, I'm further going to say, it's more of an issue of, please, Democrats, don't show up to vote, right? Because that's kind of what's going on here. Now, that said, much like we did back in the 2024 election, I don't just like to look at one single poll and then tout it. I want to see the overall average, right? What are the polling aggregates saying? Now, recently, we did show one aggregate, depending on how they actually put the polls together, which ones they choose, that had Sherill up by about 3. But for the sake of today's video, we will use the RCP average, putting different polls together. And as you can see, the average weighting of all the polls is that Mikie Sherill leads on average by a spread of 4 points. And that's, by the way, including the fact that the Fox News poll, which I do not exactly trust or think is accurate. I think it's a huge outlier, but this did indeed show Mikie Sherill up by 8. But even factoring that into the average, right, it's still Mikie Sherill plus 4, which might not seem all that great. But I want you to keep in mind 2 things. First of all, this is New Jersey. And secondly, we should also factor in, ladies and gentlemen, and this is very important, the history of how Republican candidates are underestimated by historical polling in New Jersey elections. What do we mean by that? Well, keep in mind this number, plus 4. Again, it's like plus 3, plus 4. That's usually the average when you put them all together, depending which polls you choose. Well, if you look back to the 2021 New Jersey governor's race between same Republican candidate, Jack Ciattarelli, versus then Governor Phil Murphy, you'll notice something very interesting. The final RCP average in 2021 had Phil Murphy winning by 7.8 points, right? That's what it was saying. Democrats, hey, it's New Jersey, this should be easy. It's not even going to be competitive. And yet when it came down to it, the race was actually razor thin. In the end, Phil Murphy only won by 2.8, which is to say what? Jack Ciattarelli, the Republican at the time, outperformed his polling expectations by 5 points. Well, if you do the math now, where Sherill's up by 4, right, that would mean a +1 Ciattarelli victory if that same kind of balance or weighting actually carried over. But you might sit there and say that, well, that's 2021. Maybe the polling difference might not be the same, right? Maybe they've gotten better at polling that state. And while that's possible, I would also like to point out, according to RCP, even in the 2024 election between Trump and Kamala, the final result was also, once again, really surprising to pollsters. You might actually remember this, but Kamala only won the state of Jersey by 5.9, very close to 6 points, which was certainly not expected, considering the Rutgers poll conducted in late October showed Kamala Harris winning by 20, and the Signal poll, which is even a Republican-ran pollster, showed Kamala Harris winning by 12. So are you seeing something of a pattern here that shows, even given when you put it all together, even looking at these polls that say, oh, Mikie Sherill's winning by 3? No, this is a razor-thin race. According to history, or the way we should balance it, if we're going to use that logic, it is essentially tied. And ladies and gentlemen, that is why it is so important, obviously, that you show up to vote. Do not even be dissuaded by these polls, because not only do they vastly underestimate Republicans according to historical precedent, but when you factor that in, it actually shows Ciattarelli, again, strong chance totally that he could be pulling this upset here.
There is a shift on the ground, guys, and I have to tell you, your poll is an outlier. There's a number of polls that have this as a dead heat. Republicans traditionally underpoll New Jersey. There's energy everywhere I go, and last night we picked up another very significant endorsement from another Democratic mayor. It's not the first. It's not going to be the last. There isn't a single Republican that has endorsed my opponent, whose entire campaign is based on a stack of lies, her disdain for Donald Trump, and that she can fly a helicopter. None of that is going to fix New Jersey.
Well, I know you're going to answer some questions in the diner, but we've heard this morning from folks in your state. Issues in New Jersey are the higher energy costs, immigration, property taxes, overall cost of living. Those are actually problems that a lot of other people around the country are facing, too. So when you look at your state and you see how close or neck and neck you are in a blue state, what does that tell you about the shift in our culture around the country?
All I could tell you about what's going on in New Jersey, and people have had it. They're angry over 8 years of Phil Murphy's failed policies, and my opponent is more of the same, only worse if she were to be elected. People have had it. We do have the highest property tax in the nation. We now have some of the highest electricity rates in the nation because of a failed energy master plan that my opponent has doubled down on. There's not going to be wind farms off our Jersey shore. They're not reliable. They're not cost effective. We need to go back to something that's more rational, get the electric bill down, and I will on day one by pulling us out of Reggie, which is a carbon tax policy that has failed in New Jersey. But public education is failing here, public safety. There's been an enormous spike in nonviolent crime because we're soft on criminals, and we've got a severe overdevelopment crisis in our suburban communities because of the Democrats' idea of social engineering.
So there you had Fox News pushing its D+8 strong, likely incorrect poll as gospel, but nonetheless, even according to them, here's what's very interesting. Number one, I want to point out, Jack Ciattarelli, as we just showed you, is not just telling you propaganda because he wants to raise donations. No, that is an actual fact. Republicans are massively underpolled historically in Jersey. We already proved that. But secondly, according to Fox, whose poll showed the Democrats winning, the two top issues for voters in this election are, number one, high energy costs, and number two, immigration. I remember the last time an election came down to cost of living, largely thanks to a Democrat administration that people were not happy with. And of course, number two, issues of immigration. I wonder what happened in that election, by the way. Yeah, interesting. Needless to say, I'm just going to point out, I don't know the situation on the ground. I'm not going to pretend to be a particular expert in New Jersey, considering I haven't been there in several years. But if those are the two issues that voters are really voting on, that's a slam dunk for Ciattarelli and the Republican Party, okay? So ultimately, we will see what happens there. Further, though, I like to point out, shifting now to Virginia, you're seeing a similar trend, the October collapse, continuing here for Democrats, ladies and gentlemen, because even in the governor's race, according to this poll conducted by Trafalgar, if I'm not mistaken, Trafalgar, Spanberger, the Democrat, who has enjoyed a sizable lead thus far, and by the way, I would still pin as the favorite here. Okay, I'm not actually super confident in Winsome Sears, but hey, it's starting to get super close. That's why you got to prove me wrong and go vote, right? Spanberger now only enjoying about a 2.6% lead. You can see Spanberger at 47.7%, Sears at 45.1%. If I'm not mistaken, this is basically the closest that Winsome Sears has been polling for that entire election cycle. 5% are still undecided. If those people break more hard for Sears because of especially the J. Jones scandal and Spanberger's failure to answer questions on radical social issues, then hey, that could be interesting. Now, in the lieutenant governor's race, where the Republican Reid is actually being plagued by scandal, if I'm not mistaken, even here, right? Drawing within 1 point of the Democrat, Hashimi, again, considering there is a scandal there, and then in the Attorney General's race, probably you could argue what is starting to really flip this situation. It's energizing Republicans. It's potentially driving independents to be more inclined or prone to vote for Republicans. Jason Mayar is now enjoying a comfortable over 5.8 points lead over J. Jones, the radical violent Democrat, which is certainly good news. Okay, that is optimistic to see that while 40% of the Democrat base are, still willing to go along with it and they feel the exact same way. Hey, maybe there's like a 5 to 10% who are actually off put by it and are now switching sides. Very important. Now, 8% are still undecided. I don't know what's going on there, but hey, maybe they were J. Jones voters before. Now they're kind of on the fence. That's good news too. At least you're rethinking it a little bit, ladies and gentlemen. But of course, the situation for Spanberger continues to not get any better. Take a listen here as she tries to give a 2-minute word salad defending her position on supporting men and girls' bathrooms and predators in their locker rooms, which, by the way, in this week's governor debate, she completely stumbled on. But let's take a listen here as she's going to stumble again.
What do you make of earle-sears' claim that you're fine with, quote, putting men in girls' locker rooms?
The reality is that the federal government has the ability to change the letter of the law, right? Through Congress, through the Senate, bills go to the president's desk. Right now, what we are seeing is there are differences between what is the law of the land under Title IX and what are executive orders put out by the White House. And in circumstances where there are conflicting evidence or conflicting interpretations, the reality is the federal government has to be clear in what is the real guidance available to our schools as it relates to use of locker rooms. The reality is that we have multiple jurisdictions who believe they are following the letter of the law and have their lawyers conveying why. And at the end of the day, we have a president of the United States who is taking away and threatening federal funding. What I think is so egregious is that this is a tool that unfortunately this president continues to use, the threat of federal funding. Congress passed funding. It is not the president's ability. This is, basic Article 1. This is, if you believe in the Constitution, the president doesn't have the ability to just pull back funding. And it isn't
Okay. Let me try to translate this into English. So she is referring to recent Trump executive orders that obviously try to do things like ban men from women's sports and men from women's locker rooms and actually try to uphold what would have been, or at least should have been, the original interpretation, right, of Title IX. Now, in my opinion, this is actually a layup that he gave to the Democrats in the sense that obviously, the men and women's sports thing is an 80-20 issue that Democrats are on the wrong side of. And so many Democrat governors could have easily copped out, right? Not really shown victory to Trump directly, but also distanced themselves from this issue by simply saying, oh, well, he did the executive orders, right? It's federal law now. We have to follow it. I don't have authority. Yet what you saw many Democrat governors do, like Gavin Newsom, who initially said he was for it and then months later went against it because he wanted to show he was fighting Trump for some odd reason, or the governor of Maine, who got into really big public fights over this trans sports thing. No, instead, Democrats, instead of taking the layup, they took the bait. They said, no, your executive order has no power. We're going to challenge you in court. We're going to sue you. And as Abigail Spanberger here is even further repeating, well, it's not true federal law. It's just an executive order. We don't know the authority. So you're going to take the side of men and women's sports and men and women's locker rooms, really? What an insane cop-out answer. And it's not even the right cop-out, right? You know? It's so interesting. Trump gave the Democrats the chance to get away from this issue without directly getting away from it. They didn't have to put out statements. All they had to say is, oh, well, we have to follow federal law. No, instead, they tried to play the technicality game and say, no, we're going to fight tooth and nail and put ourselves on the record showing we're for men and women's locker rooms and for men and women's sports. And ladies and gentlemen, Abigail Spanberger, just 4 years, by the way, after Glenn Youngkin defeated Terry McAuliffe largely off of the issue of the crazy trans stuff that was going on in the Loudoun County School District in the state of Virginia, is doing the same exact thing. Except now she just won't simply answer the question whatsoever, which, word salad's kind of a commonality here. We've seen whether it's the Jay Jones thing or the trans issue, on any difficult question, she just does not answer. And I wonder if people care. We'll find out.
To these public schools, it is to our research institutions. It's for cancer research. It is for funding to conservation programs under USDA that are vital to so many of the farmers and producers who employ rotational grazing practices and other conservation practices, voluntary ones, on their land, who've been promised investments, and the president just pulls back those funds. The real challenge that exists here is that we have a president who is using congressionally approved federal spending as a cudgel, and just as an issue of principle. Right now it's coming after the schools. Before, it was coming after conservation programs. Now, it's also consistently across our universities and institutions of higher education and research. It's a dire circumstance. But when it comes down to understanding the implementation of how it is that our kids are coexisting in the classroom or on the sports field, yes, I do think that in many cases it's the local community that knows their community best and can readily make decisions and provide guidance about how to ensure that all our kids are safe.
So in other words, you have no answer. Okay, 3 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, that entire clip we just listened to is 2 minutes and 51 seconds long. And at not one point did she take a stance or explain, are you fine with men and women's locker rooms or women's sports? What's your stance going to be on this issue as the governor? No, she went on this huge tangent about federal funding. And then at the very end of it, she defers and says, the local communities have to decide. Well, thank you so much for that, Abigail Spanberger. I mean, we just learned so much in that short 3-minute time frame. But hey, here we go again. Okay, I feel like Kamala Harris actually didn't really leave the Democrat Party, because now the two top Democrats running for executive positions this year are the exact same, where they cannot answer very basic questions about basic policies. And anytime it's something they don't want to talk about, they're just like, look, I was born in a middle-class family. Same exact garbage. What is going on here, right? So we'll see. We'll see what happens, guys. I just would like to point out that, the longer that this goes, similar to the Kamala campaign, actually, the more people start to know either Spanberger or Sherill, they'll start to realize, you don't really know what you're doing. You can't answer any hard questions. It's kind of an embarrassment. Spanberger, considering she has the lead, will probably be best benefited to just basically hide in a closet till November and not have to answer any questions about Jay Jones or transgenderism. But apparently she is. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the result. So again, you live in Virginia, live in New Jersey, make sure you go vote. And with that said, let me know your thoughts on this in the comment section down below. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you are new. And until next time, God bless and peace.